Hi guys, welcome back. We're going to continue on here with AP World Unit 8, Key Concept 8.6. So you recall in the last video, we went over the redrawing of political boundaries and how that led to the creation of new states. And Israel was one of our examples, Cambodia another, Pakistan, which eventually becomes Pakistan and Bangladesh. Israel and population movements to, say, the Gaza Strip. Today, we're going to start on the next portion of 8.6, newly independent states after World War II, and the extent to which newly independent states had governments take a role in guiding economic life. So here's what the key concept says. In newly independent states after World War II, governments often took on a strong role in guiding economic life to promote development. So again, this is socialism, which we have seen before can result in, for example, creation of industrial revolutions. The first examples of governments guiding economic life is Gamal Abdel Nasser's promotion of economic development in Egypt. Now, Nasser ends up being a really important figure in a lot of ways, but perhaps the most important way is that he was able to really efficiently see this new dualistic paradigm that the United States and the Soviet Union had after World War II. And he was able to use both of those sides to play off against each other to benefit what he saw as the benefit for Egypt. So Nasserism is his economic policy, and the book that I just recently used for my master's class, this one right here, Concise History of the Middle East, 11th edition by Goldschmidt and Boom. They spell Nasserism this way as opposed to this way, but you should know we're talking about the same person here, okay? Nasser represented for much of the non-aligned world the perfect example of opposition to the West. He nationalized the Suez Canal in what is probably the single best example of what we're going to call Arab socialism. For Arab socialism, capitalism really means like foreign ownership of major businesses and enterprises, or a more primitive system, oftentimes misnamed feudalism, in which land, buildings, and other sources of wealth belonged to a small native elite, while masses of Arab workers and farmers lived in dire poverty. So that's it. That's like socialism in the eyes of much of the Arab world, right? We're going to have our own resources and possessions go towards our own benefit. And for them, when they hear this term capitalism, they infer like foreigners extracting the wealth from Middle Eastern areas. And as we're going to see on this chart here, the Middle East still, I mean, up until very recent times, hasn't really produced most of the stuff in world history. You know, we look back like to this time period and see like the height of, the caliphate, and when they were producing much more of the world's GDP than they are, for instance, even still today. Uh, anyway, for them, they're going to view capitalism very differently than, like, say, American laissez-faire free market people are. The next example of socialism in newly independent states is Indira Gandhi and her economic policies inside India. Indira was the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru. Do not let the name Gandhi set you astray. She later married a man that was named Gandhi who had no relation to Mohandas Gandhi. She was Prime Minister of India for years and originally tried to appeal more to the United States, for example, by devaluing the rupee the way that the United States wanted it. But after the 1967 election, she increasingly turned to a socialistic mindset for trying to promote growth of the Indian economy. So, for example, In 1969, Indira Gandhi nationalized all Indian banks. She nationalized all of the Indian insurance industries. She nationalized the coal industry. And in 1973, passed the Trade Practices Act. But in general, most people will make the comment that Indira Gandhi's policies did not really seem to grow the economy, which takes us back to a general principle that we will tend to see. If you go to an economics class today, your professor is likely to tell you something to the effect that capitalism is more efficient. And yes, it does seem to be that that is the case. You tend to have more economic growth with less government involvement inside the economy. And the issues of India versus China are going to be one of the examples that really kinds of shows us that, right? Look at what happens with China's production of GDP after Deng Xiaoping takes power in China, and the economic liberation ends up leading to much more production going on in China versus, say, India. But the question is, like, at what cost, right? I mean, the movement to abolish slavery in the Atlantic region in the 19th century, for instance, was an example of socialism. Or, say, some of the infrastructure that was built in Manchester in response to the Industrial Revolution, right? Yeah, socialism is going to be less efficient, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen in some cases. Anyway, the next example here is Julius Nyerere and his modernization in Tanzania. Nyerere was the leader of Tanzania as it emerged from colonialism up until 1985. He was a prominent leader of the Pan-African movement, and he was an advocate for socialism. He nationalized banks and other major industries and developed close ties with communist China, for example. Then we have Sirimavo Bandaranaike's economic policies in Sri Lanka. Bandaranaike ran for office in 1960 after her husband, who had been prime minister, was assassinated. She ended up winning and ended up becoming the first woman to serve as a prime minister anywhere in the world. And she became the prime minister of Sri Lanka. She served 3 terms as head of government from 1960 to 2000. And in a similar way to India, she nationalized the banks and other industries, and likewise also tried to promote socialism. Next key concept is the migration of people as newly independent states were emerging. So, what ended up happening in a lot of cases is migration of former colonial subjects went to what were imperial metropoles. So, metropoles are the former colonizing country, usually in the major cities, and they maintained cultural and economic ties between the colony and the metropole even after the dissolution of empires. South Asians moving to Britain is perhaps the best example of this. Let's take a look at what the 2011 census said in London, right? So here's the diversity of the population of white people, Asian people, black people, and then more specifically, white British people, white Irish people, other Asian Indian people, Pakistani people, Bangladeshi people, Chinese people, Black African people, Black Caribbean people, and other Arab people to London, right? I mean, London is just like the perfect example of this because there's so many people from so many parts of the world that will maintain these cultural and economic links with, especially London, after the British Empire starts to dissolve in the post-World War II period, and a lot of people will move into London, for example. In a similar way, Algerians are going to go to France, and we could see the same stuff with like other French colonies, people from Southeast Asia, people from other parts of West Africa moving to France, and of course, Filipino people moving to the United States. So a lot of Filipino people have moved to, say, California, San Francisco, but here in Utah, I have had students that had family migrate from the Philippines even very recently. So, for example, West Valley City, Utah, And that takes us to key concept 8.7, global resistance to established power structures after 1900. Although conflict dominated much of the 20th century, many individuals and groups, including states, opposed the trend towards conflict. Some individuals and groups, however, intensified the conflicts and did things that made the conflicts grow and, in some ways, were even worse. So, examples include Chile under Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet came to power in Chile after the U.S. supported a coup to overthrow the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. The U.S. did not like how Allende had socialist leanings and so preferred the more free market Pinochet. Pinochet persecuted socialists and political critics, leading to the deaths of thousands. One of the most famous examples is Victor Jaya, who was an artist who opposed the Pinochet regime. Chile is only one example, but keep in mind the United States invades Latin American countries all of the time. There's been dozens of examples, really, even just in the last decade since World War II. But the U.S. has, of course, had the Monroe Doctrine in effect since our very early president, James Monroe. And we don't allow other nations to invade Latin America, but we do all the time. So again, the example of overthrowing the Salvador Allende government is just one of those in the curriculum. The next example is Spain under Francisco Franco. Franco came to power in 1939 after the fascist victory in the Spanish Civil War. He ruled Spain until 1975. He oppressed political opponents and dissenters, leading to between 60,000 and 400,000 executions. So again, example of those increasing the violence. Next is Uganda under Idi Amin. Amin led a coup against the Ugandan government in 1971 and declared himself to be president. At first, he was supported by Westerners, but increasingly he started looking to the Soviet Union for help as his tenure went on. He tried to annex a portion of Tanzania, leading Nyerere to send troops to invade, and those troops removed Idi Amin from power in 1979. Amin was economically incompetent, and his reign was a total disaster. He persecuted ethnic and political opponents, and somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 people were killed as a result of the persecution. Next is the buildup of the military-industrial complex and weapons trading inside the United States. So, for example, if you click here, you can see a brief little video of the National Archives and a little reflection on the speech.
The speech did not get very much attention.
That Eisenhower gives when he is leaving office, where he says, you know, every gun that is made, every warship that is launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. So Eisenhower was commenting that the United States seemed to be in the grips of this military-industrial complex that was producing massive amounts of weapons for warfare, something that the United States is still facing today. Groups and individuals challenged the many wars of the century, and some, like, of course, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and at times Nelson Mandela, promoted the practice of nonviolence to bring about political change. Militaries and militarized states often responded to the proliferation of conflicts in ways that further intensified the conflict. So again, the United States and the military-industrial complex would be a good example of this. Another one would be the U.S. escalating the Vietnam War from 1964 to 1973. And some movements used violence against civilians to achieve political aims. This is something that we usually refer to as terrorism. Although it's interesting, one group of people view terrorism oftentimes very differently than another. Sometimes people will suggest that killing civilians is justified to achieve political aims. I mean, after all, the United States certainly killed a lot of civilians in Japan in World War II with firebombing, for example, or killed civilians in Vietnam for political aims. So, anyway, this one is one of the most famous examples of terrorism in the contemporary era. That's the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Another example is the Shining Path, a communist party in Peru. The Shining Path suggested that other communist regimes weren't sufficiently trying to spread the global workers' revolution, and so began to use violence against peasants, unions, and others. Its leader, Abimael Guzman, was captured in 1992. And Al Qaeda is the next example. Al Qaeda was a terrorist organization that was created by this guy, Osama bin Laden, that could create fighters in Afghanistan under the Taliban regime. Al Qaeda notoriously attacked the United States on 9/11, 2001, when they hijacked planes and attacked the Pentagon, the Twin Towers in New York City, and were going to attack the White House, but that plane went down in a field in Pennsylvania. So finally, the key concept 8.8 is the causes for the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War happened from 1989 to 1991. That was when the United States was led by this guy as president. This is George H.W. Bush. The curriculum gives these as the reasons why the United States ended up finally being successful in winning the Cold War. Advances in U.S. military technological development, the Soviet Union's costly and ultimately failed invasion of Afghanistan, and public discontent and economic weaknesses in communist countries led to the end of the Cold War and to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, one of the key things, advances in U.S. military and technological development, is the Strategic Defense Initiative that is oftentimes nicknamed as, quote, Star Wars, right? The idea was that the United States was going to develop missiles that could shoot out of the air any nuclear bombs that were going to try to fly from the Soviet Union to hit targets in the United States. The program was largely unsuccessful at the time, but the Soviets believed that it was successful. And so, of course, eventually that was one of the reasons why the Soviet Union dissolved beginning in 1989. The next is the invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan on Christmas Day of 1979. Uh, they were trying to prop up what was a very unpopular communist government inside Afghanistan. The United States ended up being able to, therefore, basically do the same thing to the Soviets that they had done to us in some of the earlier conflicts, like the Korean War or the Vietnam War. The United States was able finally to funnel money and weapons through Pakistan into Afghanistan into the hands of people that are known as the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen largely were able to fight against the Soviets, and increasingly an American congressman named Charlie Wilson was able to funnel weapons into the hands of these guys called the Mujahideen, who used them to fight against the Soviets. The most expensive part of it for the Soviets was the shooting down of the Hind helicopters that were very expensive to produce and could be taken down really with a very inexpensive shoulder fired grenade launcher or something like that. Anyway, the Soviet Union finally withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, not coincidentally the same year as the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The invasion was very expensive, and finally, this expense of trying to maintain forces in Afghanistan just ended up being too much for the Soviet Union, and they collapsed. Uh, Now, of course, the United States never did have anyone run around Afghanistan and collect all of these weapons that we had sent to the Mujahideen. And eventually they were able to use those weapons to come to power with what's known as the Taliban government. The Taliban government in Afghanistan eventually was able to allow Al Qaeda to form as a terrorist organization inside of Afghanistan. And they, of course, would attack us on 9/11, which would launch into the war that the United States recently has just been trying to bring to an end. Anyway, the final reason here for the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War is public discontent and economic weaknesses in communist countries. So, again, the Soviet Union largely was trying to have its economy run along socialist lines, and those were just not very effective. Uh, Free markets are more effective at providing for economic growth than was socialist attempts at trying to do so. So the public eventually became very discontent against this, and eventually they were able to communicate it after the Soviet Union started to put into place a policy known as glasnost. Glasnost meant free expression or the ability to criticize the government. And once people were able to come out and legally criticize the Soviet government, they did. And they did so to a high enough extent that eventually the Soviets were like, well, if everybody hates this form of government so much, maybe we shouldn't have it. And then, of course, last is economic weaknesses. So, economic stagnation, and of course, the failures of the expense of trying to keep troops in Afghanistan and trying to keep up with advances in U.S. Weapons and military developments. Eventually, they ended up with such a high percentage of their economic system being built around black markets that they passed another policy that's known as perestroika. Perestroika meant that the Soviets would be allowed to engage in some of this free market trading. And if you've got perestroika, you don't have complete socialist control, hence, you don't have communism, hence, eventually, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which finally fully dissolved in 1991. So, as 1991 comes along, there's just a cascade of a whole bunch of these communist governments that fall. It happens in Poland, it happens in Romania. Interestingly, you can actually watch as, say, Ceausescu's dictatorship is brought down inside Romania, as these communist regimes were collapsing all over the place, Ceausescu, the leader of Romania's communist government, decided to hold a rally in Bucharest. And you can see it's just like any normal rally, right? But then as he's going along giving his speech, acestei mare manifestări populare din București, considerând aceasta ca o. You can hear the booing and screaming and all of that starting, and literally you can see the look on his face that, hey, this whole thing is about to come collapsing down, which it did. Ceausescu was executed a few days later after that video. They came in. Anyway, watch more on your own time. So, review of Unit 8 key concepts. Increasing anti-imperial sentiment led to the dissolution of empires and the restructuring of states. Technology and economic gains shifted the global balance of power after World War II. The US and the Soviet Union emerged as the two global superpowers, although the Soviet Union would collapse in 1989. The US and the SU emerged from World War II as ideologically opposed superpowers, which led to conflict around the globe. The non alignment movement emerged and challenged global dualism. The Cold War created new alliances and resulted in proxy wars. Communists came to power in China. The government controlled the national economy, and catastrophes emerged from the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Movements to redistribute land and resources developed and sometimes advocated for communism or socialism. Some colonies negotiated for independence and others fought for independence and received it. Regional struggles occurred against colonial rule and advocated for autonomy. New states were created as redrawing of political boundaries occurred with the end of colonialism. Redrawing boundaries resulted in displacement of peoples or violence. So, again, India and Pakistan or Israel. In newly independent states, governments took a guiding role in the economy. Migration occurred between former colonies and metropoles. Some people opposed the violence of the 20th century, while others intensified the conflicts. Some people used nonviolence as a tool to create change. Militaries often intensified conflicts. Some governments and some movements used terrorism to accomplish goals. And there were a number of causes for the collapse of the Soviet Union and the ending of the Cold War. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Unit 8 for AP World. I will catch you in the next video.